Eureka Springs, Arkansas. That'll be like how it starts.
Okay. My name's Petey, and I live in Eureka Springs, Arkansas.
Where were you born, and how were you raised?
Let's see, I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and grew up there. My dad's job was affiliated with the university, so kind of grew up in that world.
Was the college track kind of what was laid out for you by your parents? Was that really important, education?
They didn't put a ton of pressure on me to be a certain way necessarily. They kind of let me figure out my own path and follow my passions, and they didn't necessarily push me to be into a certain thing or whatever. So I think they did want me to go to college, but they didn't force me to do that necessarily. So I ended up going to college for just a semester to try it out. I didn't really want to go because I kind of knew that the things that I wanted to do with my life and the things that I wanted to learn didn't have to involve college, but I just kind of tried it out to make them happy, and it didn't take me long to figure out that it wasn't really what I wanted to be doing.
You started playing guitar when you were 12 or 10?
Yep, started playing music. My family is pretty musical. My dad and my stepdad were both into music and musicians, and so they was kind of just around growing up, and was definitely a big part of my life in high school. And yeah, I think around 11 or 12 was when I started playing instruments.
You playing in some bands in high school or not yet?
Yep, yeah. I started my first band when I was 14, I think. And I would just kind of like play whatever instrument was needed. I think the first band I was in, I played the drum kit because we didn't have any friends that played drums. And then I got pretty into bass because that was another one that was just needed. Like my other friends played the other instruments that we needed, so I just kind of gravitated towards that and played upright bass in jazz band and got pretty into that for a while. Once I left Michigan and was traveling around more, I started playing more portable instruments like banjo and fiddle, and that was kind of the environment that I was in more, was like being in more rural settings and playing around campfires with more acoustic instruments. And when I went to visit Acorn for the first time when I was 18, that was the first time I heard a banjo being played, so that was pretty influential for me. I think I ended up buying my first banjo like shortly after that trip. Got pretty excited about that sound and that style of music and how it's, you know, tied in with the lifestyle that I was kind of seeking out.
And that trip to Acorn, that would have been right after that? Right after that semester or right before that?
Yeah, it was the summer before I started college. I went to Virginia because I think around my senior year I started getting really interested in communal living. I got every book that I could find in my public library about communes, and most of them were you know, books about communes from the 60s and kind of the back to the land movement that had happened then. And, you know, most of the books were kind of like, this happened and, you know, this is no longer happening and it's sort of like a dying movement, blah, blah, blah. But I found a book about Twin Oaks. It was Kinkade's Walden 2 experiment in the library, and read that. And found out that it was still around, so I was pretty excited about checking it out. And I had emailed them probably when I was still in high school just to see if they were accepting people to come visit, and it took them, I think, like 6 months to get back to me, but they finally did. And so I went the year after I got out of high school. I went to Twin Oaks and did a visitor period, and then just kind of hung out at Acorn I think they had like a land day celebration that I went to.
You pretty much found out about Twin Oaks and Acorn through a public library book.
Yep. Yeah, when I was in high school, I was getting kind of disillusioned by the mainstream lifestyle of Americans at large, and was just kind of like seeking out alternatives. I started working at a small farm like around that time when I was probably 16 or 17, and the guy who owned it was like an old hippie, and like most of his stories were about how amazing Ann Arbor was in the 70s, which was pretty funny. But yeah, he kind of introduced me to what farming lifestyle could be as far as like a small scale thing goes. Working there, I got pretty excited about the possibilities of that, but being like a young person, I kind of I wasn't really interested in, like a nuclear family sort of farming setup. I wanted to have friends around, and in high school and growing up, I was always pretty social, and especially with the music, had like a crew of friends that we would all hang out a lot. So I think the combination of those two has just sort of gravitated towards looking into communal living situations. That first led me to Twin Oaks when I was 18.
You did a full visitor period there.
Yep, and then I ended up going back. So when I went there, I was just kind of pretty blown away by like how many cool things were happening there, and I met some younger people who I kind of vibed with, and they were just different from a lot of the other people that I met. They were really inspired and excited to like try new things, and very open-minded, and kind of like opened me up to a lot of possibilities of different ideas and different ways of living that I hadn't really been exposed to before. So I ended up liking it more than I thought I would, and so I went back that summer, maybe a couple months later, just see how I liked it more and spend more time there. And going back, as I was just a guest at that point. I wasn't like a visitor anymore, and I think the structure that the visitor period gave me, like going back without that, was very different. And I think because I was just like a guest, people weren't as excited to include me in things, so I think I felt more like an outsider. And then I also kind of got a little bit involved with some like polyamorous drama, so that sort of deterred me from sticking around too. I think, being 18 and just sort of like wearing my heart on my sleeve, I was a little bit just like overwhelmed by all of that and needed to get away, so I didn't end up staying for very long. I think I was only there for another month. Yeah, that was my introduction, and that's how I found out about Eastwind. And I think it wasn't too long after that I went to Eastwind for the first time. I think I did my semester at college, kind of figured out that wasn't for me, and then set up like a visitor period the next spring at Eastwind. And then 2008, I did a visitor period at Eastwind. I wasn't planning on staying there. I had this whole big road trip planned out to visit other communities and other small farms. I ended up like canceling that whole trip basically once I got to Eastwind. I just kind of got sucked into being there. I liked it, and I got to be pretty fast friends with a few people there, and so I just kind of decided to stick around for the year. I think I was still definitely like feeling it out. I didn't take it very seriously. It was cool to just be there and have the freedom to explore different interests, and I think that first year especially, I was getting really into learning about like medicinal herbs and teaching myself more about farming stuff. It was pretty freeform. Like the garden team there was pretty small, and they were just happy to have help. So I think they were pretty open to me just experimenting with different things. Like I had my own compost pile that I was kind of like experimenting with different ways of like layering it and building it and seeing what broke down faster, and yeah, learning a bunch of about herbs just through like trying different herbal medicines and like seeing how it affected me. And I think that was sort of like a turning point for me to be like, oh yeah, these plants are like actual good medicine, and it's not something that I had really been exposed to before that. And just like living closer to the land, I think was like really big for me. Like that first spring I was going out and like walking in the woods like every day and like really paying attention to like all the different trees and the plants that were coming out of the ground, and like, you know, I was like noticing for the first time like the buds swelling on the trees, and like really, you know, getting more into like plant identification and all of that. It's a good experience, good first year being there.
Can you recall any first interactions, first impressions?
Definitely not everyone was super nice when I got there. There was sort of like, I remember there being this vibe that was like, who's this new guy? Like, you know, almost like a hazing a little bit. And it wasn't like terrible or anything, but just, you could tell who was open to being friends like right away and who wasn't. And, you know, so there's a lot of like social cues that I just felt like I kind of had to pay attention to, like in the beginning, just figuring out where people were and who wanted to interact and who didn't, you know. And a lot of that I had picked up at Twin Oaks too, because like I think more so they have a culture of like, you know, they have more people coming through, so, you know, it's part of their culture to be like, oh, like check in with this person before you try to talk to them, blah blah blah. When I went to Twin Oaks and I had heard, you know, you have to like ask someone to ask a question, I was just like, that's really weird, you know, like not something that I'm used to. But, you know, after living in community for 10 years, it's like, oh yeah, I get that, you know. It's like you don't always want to be like giving someone an orientation like while you're walking down the path or whatever, you know. Yeah, I think that kind of sums it up, you know. Some people were super friendly and open, and some people weren't, and just kind of had to like pay attention to social cues to figure out who those people were.
So how early on did you think that you would pursue membership, and that you had some idea that you'd be living there for a while?
So the first year I was there, like I said, I didn't necessarily take it super seriously. I was just kind of like, oh, I'm here now and I like it, and I'm not necessarily considering this my home, but I'm going to enjoy it while I'm here. That continued for the first year because I ended up, like, shortly after I got to be a full member, I didn't necessarily want to pursue that. It's just, I think I just kind of ended up happening to be there long enough to become a full member, and then I was like, okay, like, I guess I'll do this since I'm here. But like shortly after I became a full member, I left for I think like 7 or 8 months, because at that point I had like, you know, put off this long road trip that I had been planning for a while, and I was like, okay, I still feel like I got a lot of traveling to do, so I'm gonna kind of like continue or finish this road trip that I set out to do. And the year after I first moved there, I went on my first like cross-country hitchhiking trip, and did some train hopping and just kind of traveled around for the season, and visited, you know, some of the farms that I had planned on going to. And at that point I had met up, somewhere along the trip I had met up with someone that I had been dating at Eastwind, and traveled with her for a while. Towards the end of the trip, like I think in the fall, she's like, okay, I'm like ready to go back to Eastwind. And I hadn't necessarily considered going back, but I was just like, okay, I'll try it out again. And when I had come back, that was when I really started to like feel like it was my home and become more invested in like my work there and all that. So it was a process to like feel like it was my home for sure.
When you got back, and started feeling more invested? Is that when you're getting more into the garden? What?
Yeah, I mean, I had been into the garden like the year before, but I think, yeah, when I came back as a full member, I just started taking it more seriously and learn more, teach myself more, and kind of like figure out what we were doing in the garden versus like what community needed, and trying to tie in like food processing and preservation and kitchen work into all of that too. So yeah, around that time, I think it was 2010, there was sort of like a wave of younger folks that were interested in homesteading stuff and farming stuff and like wanting to learn that stuff. A lot of those people showed up maybe like a couple years after I did. Felt like there was sort of a wave of younger people that wanted to kind of like get the farm going again, because I think for a while it sort of became like it like went on the back burner as far as like community's priorities. You know, when I first got there, there's a lot of energy going into the businesses, and there was definitely people interested in the farming aspects of community. It became more of a focus as I stayed there longer. So that was like a big motivator of like me wanting to continue to live there too, is just like seeing the development of how the farm is becoming more of a thing and more of a focus and more productive, and that goes like outside of just the garden. It's like there was like the ranch crew, and then the whole like dairy program getting started like around 2011. Yeah, there was like some exciting things happening around that time.
Yeah, because right when you got there is when the FDA would have shown up for the first time, and they had to change a bunch of stuff in the factory.
Yeah.
And then 2012, I think, is that visitor period where like 7 people became long-term members, and that was a lot of the ranch crew.
Okay.
Kaylee and Dandy and Jostin and
yeah.
a bunch of people in that one visitor period. I know they all stayed a long time.
Right, yeah. And I remember around that time with the FDA scare, we had a community meeting proposed by someone who wasn't necessarily like super involved in the farm, but was like sort of a proponent of it, and he was sort of like a prepper character a little bit, but this meeting was basically like this one person being like, yeah, we should really like put more energy into like making our farm more productive and like having it be more of a focus in community. And it seemed like a little bit unnecessary, because I felt like we were already going in that direction, but it's kind of cool to think about how that was like sort of a turning point for community.
And you were there were you on the land when the Showerhouse burned down?
I was, yeah. Yep. I remember Elena coming down to my house, because I lived in Gitchigumi at that time, which is one of the cabins. And she knocked on my door at like 6 in the morning and just like came in and was like, the Showerhouse burned down last night, like while we were still sleeping. She said that, and we were just kind of like, go away, like why are you here? And then we, as we kind of woke up more, we were like, oh shit, like yeah, that really happened. So that was crazy.
You didn't see the fire?
No, I guess a bunch of people had woken up and were like watching it burn.
Right.
Because at that point it was too late to really try to put it out. No, somehow we slept through all the fire trucks running through and everything.
It's pretty far down the hill.
Yeah.
I mean, you had talked a little bit about the polyamorous relationships. You had at Twin Oaks that kind of may have caused a little more trouble than you anticipated, or had the experience to foresee. How, in general, how were relationships in the community context? Because you started and ended some number of relationships and still stayed there, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, breakups were hard in community for sure, and I saw a lot of people leave because of that. And yeah, and I think because of how like insular the dating pool is at Eastwind, it can be pretty hard to be polyamorous there because well, for one, your options are pretty limited, but also like yeah, you just know what's going on with the other people all the time, so you really have to be involved with the right kind of people who are into putting that like emotional work in that is required to like confront your jealousy and all of that. So it can be pretty hard. But it was a learning experience for sure, because I was in a polyamorous relationship at least for a couple years, and then had tried different things too. Yeah, it definitely taught me a lot about myself and just like what my own capabilities are as far as like dealing with my own jealousy and emotions, and I think overall it just made me more of an independent person and more comfortable with myself.
Were you monogamous for a period of time? Did you attempt that?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know, it's hard to say. Obviously, like, the system of the place and, like, the land and everything outside of the people were great, it was like, it's a really, like, ideal situation and place for a community in a lot of ways, but, like, more than anything, it's the people that kept me there, it was the relationships that I had that made me want to continue living there, and, because we're all, like, we were all just, like, creating the culture every day, it was, like, we made it happen, we made what we wanted it to be, so, like, the people who were there, like, strongly affected your experience. And I tried to live my life there with that in mind too, just like really trying to like support and like inspire other people and be there for other people, and I was there for community, but lovers is definitely part of it too,
Well, let's talk a little bit about the nut butter factory.
I like the nut butter business when it was functioning smoothly. Like in the most ideal situations, it was pretty sweet because, we weren't required to do a whole lot, and I was primarily a roaster, which was a pretty fun job. Like you'd get up in the morning and roast the nuts for the afternoon milling shift and packing shift. So typically I'd only have to do like 1 or 2 roasting shifts a week, and that was considered fair share for contributing to the business. And so I wouldn't say I was like super heavily involved, but the level of involvement and the stuff that I did do was pretty great.
Yeah, so you were, a production worker in the factory, but outside in the gardens, you were quite often the manager or one of 2 managers, right?
Yeah, in the garden.
And you and Richard, who were similar ages, both played significant roles in greatly expanding the vegetable garden at the time. So maybe just kind of walk through that from the beginning.
Okay. Yeah, so Richard got there around the same time as me, and he was like also really into farming stuff and permaculture and all of that. And at the time when we got there, we had a really big area called the Lower Garden that had a lot of potential, but it was so far away from everything that it was hard to get people to work down there, and just kind of a headache to get the right tools that you needed, and there was a lot of walking back and forth, and the fences weren't solid either. So around that time, I think it was 2010, we had worked out a deal with the ranch crew to where we were going to trade a pasture that was closer to the center of community with our current lower garden. And that year we put up a 10 foot deer fence around that whole pasture, which used to have the dairy barn there, but it got torn down like maybe a year or two before we put the garden where it is now. And that having it closer to community really helped put more energy into it. And you know, we kind of like from the start designated certain areas for certain things. So like 1/4 of it we had set aside just for orchard trees, and then another maybe a little bit less than 1/4, but another corner of it we'd kind of set it aside for perennials and herbs and stuff like that. Richard was always really interested in perennials too, so he was constantly planting different things, and the orchard was basically just a big experiment to see what would do well in the Ozarks, and it was cool. It was cool to see just have that freedom to experiment, and you know, have the budget to be like, yeah, we want to try planting these like berry bushes that we've never even heard of before, but you know, what we've read about it sounds like they're gonna do good here, like that kind of thing. And yeah, I had a couple different flocks of ducks down there, running them through the orchard, just kind of trying to experiment with like herding them through garden beds to see if they would eat pests and stuff like that. Of course they didn't eat any of the bugs that I wanted them to, but just, you know, having that kind of freedom to experiment was really cool. And you know, without the pressure of like having to support the community through the products in the farm. When I first got there, there was maybe like this mentality that, you know, the garden wasn't really all that worth it to like put so much energy into, or maybe like, you know, people who had been there for a while had seen like a lot of things fail in the garden, so they had maybe formed like more of a negative view on like what it was or something. But I think over time that mentality changed quite a bit.
You know, you had so much experience there. You know, if you were to give advice to someone who is living at Eastwind or going to be there, ideas as far as advice or how to approach certain things?
I mean, one thing that I saw a lot, and I feel like I still see it when I go back to visit, is these people show up who are really, you know, have a ton of energy and a ton of skills, or at least like, you know, are inspired to learn, and just really driven to like make community into, you know, a better place for everyone. And they take on like way too many jobs, and they get burnt out really quickly. And so yeah, if I was gonna have advice for any new person, I would just say probably like take things on slowly, and just be aware that burnout is real there and it happens quite often. It's exciting when you show up there and you're like, oh man, there's like so many possibilities of things that could be or could happen, and when you look around and you don't see inequality and like that excitement, it's easy to like get discouraged.
Played a big role in the gardens at Eastwind for a long time, and you've also worked at a number of other professional farms, and right now you work at a commercial market farm. So maybe how did the Eastwind experience prepare you for that, and what was very different?
So probably one of the things that I miss most about Eastwind is that it's it's so much more of like a holistic experience based, like, compared to working at a market farm, because you're not only like growing and like harvesting and doing that whole side of it, you're also like seeing it through to it being put on the table for a community. So like I really miss doing like all these big food processing projects, you know, like making kimchi and pickles and salsa and tomato sauce and like all of these, like putting up food for the winter. Like that was always like really fun, and like people would always like, there was energy to make these things fun too. Like it was seen as like this like group activity that people could like rally around and like have a good time with. It wasn't like seen as a chore, you know. So yeah, I miss that a lot. I mean, yeah, outside of like having it be more of like a holistic thing of like having to put it up for storage and all of that, I think, you know, working at a market farm that is a business, I've learned a lot about just efficiency, and like efficiency becomes way more of a necessity when you're like viewing everything by like labor hours and like how, like what goes into it versus what you're making. And at Eastwind there wasn't so much pressure behind that, which was really nice, especially when we were, you know, in the early years when we were kind of figuring out how to do things still. So yeah, just not having the, you know, being able to take your time at a task and like really enjoy it, and like, you know, have good conversations while you're doing it with the people you live with is like pretty sweet, and you know, something that I maybe took for granted when I lived there.
What do you remember from being on membership, and how it's a pretty important role?
Yeah, I started out doing membership, being pretty excited about it, because I was like, oh, here's this chance for me to kind of like, I think I saw my role as being more on the ground support because of my involvement with the garden, and a lot of the newer folks would kind of gravitate towards working in the garden because it always needed help and it was easy to plug into. For like most of the time that I lived there, I was pretty involved with the new people and involved with the visitors and getting to know them pretty quickly through that. I felt like I could be a good person to kind of like welcome people in and make sure they like have their needs met and are feeling comfortable in this new place and blah blah blah. So like me and a friend made this little like Eastwind zine, which sort of covered some like social norms and like just general things that people would want to know maybe when they show up, that are all pretty much unspoken things. After I became membership manager, or one of the managers, I was trying to make more of an effort to like talk to the visitors and stuff, but it's a really hard job. Like there's tons of interpretation in the legislation around like accepting people and like telling people that they have to leave and all of that. So it's not as cut and dry as I thought it would be. And there's a lot of times where I'd have to go to the board being like, what do I do in this kind of situation, blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, people would be upset with like how me and the membership team were interpreting the rules, and you know, because there is a lot of like gray areas, and like it needs to be, you know, somebody's got to make a decision, and in those situations you're never going to make everyone happy. So I think that was like the hardest part, and then also just like having to tell people that they had to leave. I think around the time that I started doing membership, I like community as a whole was trying to collectively be more selective. So we were telling more people that they had to leave than before, for sure, which in my opinion was a good thing, but it just makes for a lot of hard conversations, you know.
So that's on the front end. But maybe let's talk a little bit. You were on the social committee for a short amount of time, but you also just lived there for a decade.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about the party scene and how people's drinking can get out of hand, especially over long periods, and kind of like the drama and the events that can happen in that atmosphere, and I don't know, the kind of trends that you noticed in your time there.
Drama trends.
Well, you know, people getting into the meetings. You know, we need to have a meeting about this person.
People being taken to meeting.
We need to. This person crossed the line or whatever way they crossed it, and we have to have a meeting. And maybe they stay, maybe they go, and maybe there's another meeting. Just kind of that whole.
I mean, those situations were always weird for me. Like, I usually didn't feel super involved. So, and I guess that was, like, a choice for me, too. Like, I tried to stay out of the drama as much as I could, which, like, is helpful to a certain extent, but then I think at some point there is, like, this pressure to be like, oh, you're being apathetic if you don't take a side kind of thing, which was pretty hard for me just because it's like, well, in most situations, it's like, I just want to stay out of it, you know? But, you know, especially later on in my membership, I felt like there was maybe more of an attempt to, like, hold people accountable for their actions and stuff. And, like, around that time, there was, like, sort of, like, this social pressure of, like, you need to choose a side, like, in, like, every situation, like, and, like, obviously that becomes more clear when, like, there is, like, a community vote. Like, you have to, like, vote a certain way. I guess you don't have to vote at all if you don't want to, but then there's, like, the pressure of not voting too. So all of that's, like, pretty interesting, I think, overall. Like, I think it's just, like, a good representation of, like, what happens when a society or group of people starts, like, self-policing. You know, it's like, it just gets really, really messy.
You know, the social scene there is a lot of fun. It's pretty easy to get into, and especially you as a musician are especially popular at parties and these types of things. You know, what kind of memories do you have of the social scene, and also how did that change for you coming in as a 19-year-old and then living there through your late 20s?
Eastwind's always kind of had, like, a work hard, play hard philosophy, and a lot of my best memories there are, like, just doing, like, pretty hard physical labor and then, like, just partying really hard all in the same day. And I mean it made for a really fun lifestyle for a while. You know, eventually the longer I lived there, I got a little bit burnt out on it, and became a little bit more reclusive, especially, like, the last couple years I lived there. There's more reasons to that than just, like, getting burnt out and getting older. I think, you know, as my friend group changed over the years, and, like, certain people that I was close with that were into partying more, like, left, and, like, it became more close with, like, other people that weren't into that as much. You know, it's always shifting, like, friend groups and just the people that live there.
You and I were the Eastwind FEC delegates for 2 years, I think.
Yep.
And we're known as the greatest of all time in that arena. But you were the delegate even longer than I was. Talk about the FEC and what it meant to be an Eastwind delegate.
So the FEC is a really cool aspect of Eastwind. It's like a network of communities that are connected to Eastwind through like labor exchange, and there's like a shared healthcare fund that communities have together, and the delegates would get together once a year to talk about different issues and set their budget for like different projects they want to fund and stuff like that. So I think for me it was a really cool way of feeling like I was part of something bigger than Eastwind, because one thing I struggled with being there was getting lost in like the microcosm of the village that existed there. You know, a lot of people, myself included, living there would like barely leave the property, and you know, see the same 70 people every day, more or less. So like the FEC became pretty crucial for me to just have like a bigger perspective of like why we're doing what we're doing, and you know, even just like talking to other people who are doing similar things was always like pretty inspiring, and like learning from other communities about how you can deal with different problems in a better way, or like even just a different way different communities focuses, and like what is possible as far as communal living goes. Like all of that is pretty cool. That's why I was interested in becoming the delegate, and the conferences were always pretty inspiring in that way. But yeah, I don't know. It got to be pretty messy. I don't know if I want to talk about that.
Yeah, I don't plan on going any farther on that one. I'm going to talk plenty about the FEC on my little video. Yeah, so why did you leave Eastwind?
I left Eastwind mostly just because I wanted access to like different opportunities. You know, I'd lived there for a really long time. I felt like in some ways I wasn't being pushed enough, like I wasn't being challenged enough. I wasn't challenging myself. It wasn't on other people. It was on me that, you know, I wasn't challenging myself enough. Because I kind of felt like I had fallen into like a role there, and it was really hard for me to get out of that role because people kind of like expected, or I don't know, it was maybe like self-perceived, but there was like an expectation of like me fulfilling this role in community, and when I tried to step out of it, it didn't seem to work out that well. So yeah, part of it was that I wanted to be challenged more, and I wanted access to different opportunities. And then I think part of that too is that like because of the egalitarian philosophy, it's hard to support people's like individual talents like as a system there. And I don't want to say that I wasn't supported specifically, but like I saw like other people who had like, you know, specific talents that they really wanted to like kind of engage in more, and be able to like integrate that into their like labor there, and not working out for one reason or another. Yeah, I guess part of leaving was just wanting to be able to focus on what I was feeling passionate about. It's also like a location thing too. It was just so isolated that it's hard to have connections outside of the bubble, and like what I wanted to pursue kind of required that. So
right. And you, the last 4 years at Eastwind, you started playing in a local band and would go to shows, Creek Stink.
Yeah, and it was pretty fun, but it was definitely like challenging. It just, you know, required a lot of driving, and just like, you know, getting my work covered when I had shows to play and stuff like that was always tricky. But you know, it's tricky even now in my situation too. So you know, it's just kind of part of it.
Trying to be a bluegrass musician in the Ozarks.
And a farmer, yeah.
And a farmer, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are definitely some of my best memories, getting in a 11-person van, 12-person van, and going to Springfield for a show.
Yep.
Those were some good nights. Sometimes we'd have 2 vans, right?
Yep.
Have to get 25 people coming out.
Yeah, I can talk about one funny experience I have with that. The only time I've ever been pulled over was in an East Wind van, and I think we were on our way to one of my shows or something, but I was driving and we had I think 12 people in the back of this like church van, no seats, everyone was just sitting on the floor of the van, and you know, the cop comes up and asks for IDs, and I think like 2 people had IDs or something like that, and I'm just like, oh man, we're so screwed. And so I end up going into the back of the cop car with the cop to talk to him about what the hell we were doing. I mean, who knows what he thought I was doing driving the van full of a bunch of random people, but I kind of explained, you know, where we were coming from, our like community that we had going on, and sort of like the general philosophy of our lifestyle and stuff. And like, yeah, I don't know what I was expecting telling him that kind of stuff, but he was like really excited about it, and he ended up letting us off from my speeding ticket because of me breaking it down for him. So that was kind of cool.
Do you remember driving through Kentucky in the silver minivan and I got
Yep.
pulled over?
Yep.
Because your dirty hippie feet were on the dashboard. And they stopped, they searched, they got everyone out, they took me into the cop car. They were grilling me.
Yep.
In a hot cop car, wouldn't put the window down, wouldn't give me air. And they were searching the vehicle. They had the dog come out looking for drugs.
Yeah, we had a bucket of lard that we were bringing to Acorn. And the dog signaled on the bucket of lard. And that's why they searched the van. And then they didn't stop searching the van until they found a bunch of dildos.
There were a bunch of dildos in a bag of a person we didn't even know. We like knew their first name, had just met them, and we were driving them back. So you dropped to associate status.
Yep.
After the pandemic hit, or when was...
I think it was fall of 2019. I bought a car, so I had to drop to associate.
Okay.
But at that point, I was already planning on moving to Eureka, so that's why I like bought the car and was kind of like getting ready to leave. But I spent another few months there as an associate, and I think I still technically am an associate.
Okay. Well, maybe talk about, you know, some people leave in a manner in which they're not welcome to return. And then there are more amiable people like yourself who, you know, there wasn't a big blow up and you had to go. It was, you know, you made a series of decisions and you wanted to change where you're living. But you still have a pretty strong, or at least those, for a year afterwards, you would still go to Eastwind for extended periods. And
Yeah.
maybe just talk about being in Eureka Springs and...
Yeah, so I only live like a couple hours away, so I'll go and visit every so often, and I'll go to parties and stuff, and you know, I feel like I still have a relationship with a lot of people there, and it's cool, you know, like I never wanted to like burn bridges leaving, you know, I wanted to maintain a good relationship with the place, and because I still think it's a really cool project and always has a lot of potential. It just, you know, got to the point where it wasn't what I needed to be doing anymore. But yeah, like I've seen people leave in all sorts of ways. Like a lot of people self-sabotage their situation for an excuse to leave, because I think it is hard for people to leave being in a potentially pretty comfortable living situation where like all of your needs are met. So I think unconsciously a lot of people will like just like cause a bunch of drama for themselves so they get kicked out or whatever, or you know, have to leave and feel like they can't go back to like face whatever happened. For me, it was maybe hard to initially know what I wanted to do outside of living there, because it's just, you know, it is such a bubble, and it's hard to like be aware of the opportunities that are available when you still live there, especially like given the like your economic situation. But yeah, once I made a decision of what I wanted to do, it was pretty easy transition. I also left with two people who I like moved into a house with, and kind of like was able to continue to have like a collective living situation. So I think that made it a lot easier for me to like not feel like my transition was so different, such a different lifestyle.
You left with one person you had lived with for 10 years together.
Yeah.
And there were 4 of you, right? Weren't there 4 East Winders there for a time?
I mean, one of them had already left, so that's why I say we didn't live together, but...
You left 2.
Yeah.
And there was 3 or 4 of you living in that house pretty much.
Right.
And then when you moved out of that house, they got their own place, and now you live on a homestead with...
Right. So, yeah, in my living situation now, I'm like living with 2 people who used to live at East Wind. I'm living in the same town with a handful of other people who used to live at East Wind. So I feel like pretty tied in with the community still, even if, you know, it's not all people who still live there. There's like this whole kind of network forming around where I live of people who used to live there. So it's kind of cool. I mean, like, the people that I've met and got to know there are like some of my closest friends, because like it's, you know, it's easy to get really close with people really quickly there when you're like spending all of your time with them, and you know, you're working and you're living and you're playing and you're doing all the things with these people. It's like, it's kind of like speed dating for friends, you know. You get to know, you can get to know people really quickly if you want to. And like now that I'm not living there anymore, I'm just kind of reminded of like yeah, it is kind of harder to make friends, you know, in the outside world. Yeah, I feel lucky that I can still like have relationships that I made in community, and you know, I think in the best situations, like everyone who goes to Eastwind is, you know, sort of like taking these like lessons of, you know, how to build community and like taking it back to where they're from or where they're going. And you know, in the best situations, we're like trying to create community wherever we are, you know. So that's sort of what I see Eastwind as, is just like it's definitely like a school for, it's a place to learn that kind of thing. And you know, it's there's some people that, you know, spend like the majority of their life there, but the average stay there is like 2 to 5 years. So I think a lot of people are just learning what they can and what they want to, and then hopefully bringing it back to wherever they're going and keeping the dream alive. Yeah, spending most of my 20s at Eastwind obviously has like shaped me as a person quite a bit. I feel like I'm able to like pursue the lifestyle that I am now because I spent so much time there, and like feel comfortable with it. My lifestyle definitely feels a lot different from my lifestyle at Eastwind now. Like I think about you know, now I feel like I have all of these like I'm way more on a schedule, and I always kind of have a place that I have to be at a certain time, and there was some of that at Eastwind, but you know, when the commute is like a quarter-mile walk up the path, it's a lot easier than like a half-hour drive or something. So yeah, I definitely miss not having to drive so much, and just like the random times that you would meet people along the path and then end up spending the whole day with them, you know, that kind of thing, just like random meetings. I feel like a lot of social stuff has to be like pre-planned now, and you know, you have to like call people ahead and drive and blah blah blah. It's like doesn't seem as like of a natural thing.
Get a COVID test.
Yeah, that too.